Hello again, Cinema Appreciation. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Today we're continuing on our journey on kinetics and the idea of the movement. Film is a visual medium that's actually meant to move, whether that's through dance and choreography, or that's through fighting, whether that's through camera movements, or whether that's through distortions of movement, the two things that we'll actually talk about today. We'll start off with the different ways we can actually move a camera. And here's a pretty good synopsis. Your book generally lists out 5 different movements here. And as you'll see here, there are 6 that are listed, and we'll talk about the differences here. Your book basically lists dolly and truck as the same. But note, in real film industry, they are actually different. A dolly is basically this lateral movement forward and backward, whereas a truck shot is generally along the side. So if there's a runner, you'd be following them along in a profile view in a truck, as I'll show you in a little bit. And dolly allows you to follow right behind someone or right in front of someone as if a car is driving at you, and you actually get to keep the face of the individual in the car right in front of you. So that's 1 and 2 that are actually put together. We also have the idea of a crane shot that shows up. Your book actually makes the idea that the crane shot is not actually a camera movement, but actually literally the idea of a different type of shot because it goes to an aerial shot. And we can argue whether that is true or not. But note there's some differences that show up depending on how complicated we want to make the camera movements that show up. The other one that doesn't show up in your book is actually the roll. And the idea of the roll is rolling the camera over on top from one another to the other side. So basically keep it on a pivot point and you rotate it around almost in a 180 or a 360. And that's something your book just does not consider. So that is actually a fair amount of camera movement, particularly when you want to show people in very active sequences. But otherwise, as we'll see, the idea of the pan of going from one side to the next with a stationary fixed point, the idea of the tilt going up and down to show power dynamics of whether it's looking down at you and minimizing you or looking up at you and showing your power, and the idea of zooming in and out on someone. So all those other ones are ones that actually show up pretty frequently, as we'll talk about. So the 5 camera movements as they show up, but again, we can argue that there's 6 or 7. We want to include roll, which I did not here. So the first one is going to be the idea, as we can see here, of the crane shot. The idea of going up and down with a kind of a movable hoist. And note, going from the up, we get an overview of everything that's about to happen. And then we move down, and we can move all the way down into where we have the equivalent. Basically, we're at eye level, so we can actually see equivalence in what's taking place. If we want to show the power, we can even go lower and go all the way down to a low shot, show them how much more powerful they are when they're fighting, when it appears that we have more of the God's eye view from above or the bird's eye view. So that's the point of a crane shot. You really do get an overview really nicely of the action. You'll also note the tilt shot here, where we can actually show you a full range of, by just having a stationary camera, we can actually show you the full range of what's above us and what is below us. It's great to show a child's perspective, so a child looks up at the world, or someone who's really tall and actually looks down and has to see what the world looks like beneath them. It's great to show power like you would see in the trunk shots that come out of Quentin Tarantino when we talk about a tour theory. So that tilt shot is when you have a stationary image and you're going to push up and down. You'll note the pan shot is the exact same thing, only rather than going up and down, we're going left and right. And so it's fantastic for following things like, in the Serengeti, these lovely lion hunts. So you literally can follow along as best you possibly can to see long distances. So you get a lovely establishing shot across using a pan. The dolly shot, often used then in terms of kind of following, note we'll have a dolly shot. We're going to stay right in front of Forrest Gump while he's jogging towards us. Versus over here, note we have a truck shot, which is following right along. Here you see a truck shot, which is actually sometimes called a track shot, which generally it follows along the track. And we're going to stay really equivalent with Forrest Gump as he starts to run over here in the truck shot versus the dolly shot where we stay right in front of him and we're just moving backward also with our camera. Sometimes mounted even to a car or to a truck that allows us to keep up with whatever motion, fast motion that happens. To show you all the different pieces, let's watch a scene from Forrest Gump. And arguably the most famous from Forrest Gump. Crane shot pulling up. But we're still on that crane. Look, now we have a kinetic movement. We've got to stay in front of him. And so we actually have to have ourselves in a lovely dolly. Now we're in a track shot.
When I got there, I thought maybe I'd run to the end of town.
We have a stationary that was a crane shot.
When I got there, I thought maybe I'd just run across Greenbow County.
So no, that's a crane shot that just allows him to move past us. We've just changed the height.
That's what I did. I ran clear across Alabama. No particular reason, I just kept on going. I ran clear to the ocean.
And of course, this is going to be a birth of a montage. A montage is to assemble. Basically, when you take long pieces of time and you combine them to get a symbolic element, you generally put a song behind them. We're about to get that in Forrest Gump. Talk about why he's running and all the media coverage he gets.
Might as well just turn back. Keep right on going. When I got tired, I slept. When I got hungry, I ate. When I had to go, you know, I went.
And so
And remember, Tom Hanks knew that this film was going to be an enormous success, so did not get paid for actual the running or of the performing within here. Note we're keeping up with him on side of him in the profile view. So these are variations. So this is oftentimes if they're moving away from us, that will be a crane shot. But if we're keeping up with them in the profile, that's the truck shot. Note the crane slowly moving up. This is the beautiful scenery. So here's a crane that's actually following him and ends up in a dolly shot from above. Right, that's the truck shot from the side, keeping up with him. But did not get paid for this because he was going to be such a success. He asked for 10% of the proceeds. So now we're in a dolly shot. We're running right in front of him, keeping up with him. So he's running at the camera as we're keeping the same pace, moving backward.
Alabama, stopping only to sleep, has been running across America.
For the fourth time on his journey across America.
This is a media montage, then all the media that's covering him, trying to figure out why he would do it.
I'll be damned.
Sir, why are you running?
Why are you running? Are you doing this for world peace?
Are you doing this for the homeless?
Are you running for women's rights?
Or for the environment? Or for animals? They just couldn't believe that somebody would do all that running for no particular reason.
Why are you doing this?
I just felt like running. I just felt like running.
It's you. I can't believe it's really you.
Now, for some reason, when I was doing it seemed to make sense to people.
I mean, it was like an alarm went off in my head, you know? I said, here's a guy that's got his act together. Here's somebody who's got it all figured out. Here's somebody who has the answer. I'll follow you anywhere, Mr. Gump.
So, I got company. And after that, I got more company. And then, even more people joined in.
See, stationary camera. We're not actually moving. We technically don't have a truck shot here. We just move the camera in a pan angle. So if you keep up as you're moving along, then you get the truck shot. Because it's on a track. So here we do have a dolly shot again.
I'm in the bumper sticker business, and I've been trying to think of a good slogan. And since you have been such a big inspiration to people around here, I thought you might be able to help me come to whoa, man, you just ran into a big pile of dog shit.
It happens.
What, shit?
Sometimes. And some years later, I heard that fella did come up with a bumper sticker slogan, and he made a lot of money off of it. Another time, I was running.
Here's that crane shot coming down again.
Lost all his money in the t-shirt there. He wanted to put my face on a t-shirt, but he couldn't draw that well, and he didn't have a camera.
Here, use this one. Nobody likes that color anyway.
Have a nice day. So some years later, I found out that man did come up with an idea for a t-shirt. He made a lot of money off of it. Anyway, like I was saying, I had a lot of company. My mom always said, you got to put the past behind you.
And here's the crane shot, very carefully lowing
And I
down,
think that's what my running was all about.
putting Forrest Gump right in the middle of the scene with
I
his
had run for
followers,
3 years.
right in the middle of a road, beautiful Monument Valley, where
14
Western
days,
films all used to be
16
shot in. Right, a cut to the head and shoulder shot. Now it's over the shoulder, full shot. Full shot. Slowly zooms in to get the features. To the head and shoulder shot.
I'm pretty
Right,
tired.
the medium close up there.
Think I'll go home now.
And then showing the minimalization of his character, because what are these people going to follow now? As he slowly descends back into the wilderness where he came from. Right, and becomes part of the everyday crowd.
And just like that, my running days was over. So I went home to Alabama.
And so you can combine some of these as well. So one of the most famous ways of combining was invented by Alfred Hitchcock in one of his movies called Vertigo, where he has what's called the Dolly Zoom effect. And the Dolly Zoom is an interesting feature. The Dolly Zoom is an interesting feature because what you're going to do is you're going to use an image that moves right towards or right away from your character. At the same time, you're going to zoom in or zoom out. And when you do that, zoom in, zoom out with a telescope lens, what you end up having is you have a distortion of space at the same time as you're moving. So we can make you get really close and make it look like they're coming at you because the distance is disappearing towards you, right? So this is the idea of your taking your dolly back and at the same time zooming in. Or you can have the opposite here. You know, you can have or not the opposite, but you can have a variation here where you are actually zooming in and dollying back. So very similar to this at the same time. But you can see the distortion that happens that's really quite amazing that you could play around with. So call it a dolly zoom. Thank you, Mr. Hitchcock. We also have 5 major mechanical distortions that happen. Those 5 major mechanical distortions are the following. One is going to be animation, where each frame is photographed separately at 24 frames per second. And so then you put them all together. Fast motion, it's photographed at slower speeds than 24 frames per second, or manipulated post-production, and then you actually play them at 24 frames per second. You get this humorous effect. We have the idea of slow motion, events photographed at faster speeds than 24 frames per second. So when you play them at 24 frames per second, it's manipulated. And what's beautiful about this, as we already seen in Saving Private Ryan, you get this tragic languid effect that actually slows the motion down, etherealizes it so you can see everything. We also saw this in Matrix last week. We're going to have the idea of reverse motion, and we're going to have freeze frame. Reverse motion, we don't see all that often because we generally see the impacts, not where the impacts have come from. So animation, each frame is photographed at 24 frames per second. There's 3 main ways of doing animation, or has been throughout time. There is cell animation, which is basically frame by frame drawing and playing them together. There's the idea of stop motion, which we have within King Kong and later largely kind of saved by Timothy Burton. And now we have CGI, this computer generated imagery and animation that shows up. So you don't have to draw everything. The computer will actually help you manipulate the program as you're moving forward. We have fast motion, and the fast motion is mostly comical, as you can see here, right? You film it at less than 24 frames per second. And when you play it at 24 frames per second, it speeds up the entire action. So it's great for showing comedy. Also great if you want to show kind of the passage of time and the number of cars or weather. We generally use those types of effects in films more effectively. The third one is the idea of slow motion. Again, we've seen this over and over already, both in Tom Hanks and in kind of etherealizing and lovely individuals who are doing sports or The Matrix, where you photograph the events at faster speeds than 24 frames per second, and then you manipulate them, and it gives you this this really ethereal, beautiful way of looking at motion and the events, so you can concentrate on just how amazing either the event is or how tragic and terrifying the event is. 3, reverse motion, which is just rare, and we often always use this for a comical event. I mean, look, an amazing individual jumping over a bull, that just doesn't happen. And we have the same thing with the individual putting a door together rather than beating the door up within the process. We seldom use this, and when we do, it's almost always comedy. And finally is the idea of a freeze frame. A freeze frame basically says, what do I want to do that is so important about that particular second within the show? What is so amazing that I want to stop here and pause? So in this one, it's a spoof, of course, of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, but with individual and characters that have no business, no holy business being in here. These are individuals that have deep flaws, comedic routines, problems, and you have him sitting here as Jesus. So by framing it, it does make us concentrate on how they're comparing this with the message from Leonardo da Vinci on The Last Supper. And the right, one of your top 100 films from all time, this is Thelma and Louise. This is the first female buddy comedy. No, not the first buddy comedy, but the first time we have female buddy comedy. It's also the film where Brad Pitt got his start as this very sexy, early 20-year-old individual that basically comes on or has come on to actually the two women here who are trying to figure out what they want to do. Now, rather than showing them die and be caught by the police at the very end, they jump off. But no, the movie stops right there. It stops with a freeze frame, so you don't actually see them plummet to their deaths. Why? Because in that moment, they have decided that they have absolute freedom before they plummet to their deaths. It's the only time they've ever had absolute freedom. So Thelma and Louise. Now, as we want to do things like make a chase scene, watch how we do the different elements.
How we made our action scene foot chase.
So here's a foot chase of Trevor being stalked. And note the different variations we're going to use in camera techniques that show up.
Welcome to Film Riot, the show that takes mystery out of the effects and techniques, quotes some of your favorite Hollywood films. I'm your host, Ryan Conley, and recently we teamed up with DJI to create a few action scenes with behind-the-scenes episodes to go along with them for their channel. So I flew out to Vancouver to shoot with some insanely talented people out there to make the project happen. You can see the first of those full episodes on DJI's channel right here. It has a lot of stuff that you're not going to see on our channel. But today we're taking a look at the first of those 5 scenes. We're going to be posting a new one each week. You're going to find content for that on our channel here and on DJI's YouTube channel. But now, if you haven't seen the first scene that we just released, before you watch this, make sure you watch the full scene right here or right here, because we're about to spoil a lot. What you see in the final scene is not what I actually wrote at all. I had a totally different script for this scene that never got shot. Since we're trying to do a lot with very little amount of money, I needed to stay flexible, which meant adjusting for what we could actually get. So on the day,
and that's something for all of you to consider when you are creating your own films or chase scenes that we will do in class.
Normally, we'd be able to move the schedule around, but this was extremely low budget with everyone's time already blocked and unmovable, since a lot of them would be going off to other jobs right after this project. So our timeline was locked, which meant we had to get this scene done and shot that day. So the first thing that I did was to walk around the location with Trevor Addy, who was my stunt coordinator on this and is absolutely amazing. We talked about what stunts could be done in place of my original ideas, and then it was just a matter of coming up with an alternative scene that would accomplish all the same goals from my original intention from the script. And this is why I always prepare like crazy for every shoot, but keep in mind that things are going to go wrong. So I make sure to stay flexible and not marry myself to any one idea. Instead of focusing so much on what of the project, I focus on the why. Why are we doing the things that we're doing, which leads to the what that really matters. What emotional
and this works for your individual filmmaking projects. It's very hard to do this for a larger, big budget Hollywood film. But for your films, this actually makes a good strategy.
So for this scene, since I was sort of making it up as I went along, I decided to shoot in chronological order as much as possible. The opening running through the woods was the only exception here. I decided to save that one for last,
since I knew if we ran out of time on the day, I could still cut a scene without that opening. And with that in mind, we started out with a fight scene between Cassandra and Katie. Cassandra and Katie are both excellent stunt women and actors. Katie actually played Kitty Pryde in X-Men 2, which I did geek out about just a little bit. But shooting this fight was pretty straightforward using triangle coverage. The complicated moment came from the stunt, which was also mixed with some VFX. To pull this off, we grabbed 4 shots. First was the closer side angle of Cassandra acting out the kick on Katie, then a clean plate, and finally the last 2 shots were lockdown wide shots, both from the same angle. First was Katie doing her fall off the ledge on the mats below, and then without cutting the camera or even touching it, with everyone rushing in, we moved out the mats, and then Katie positioned herself where she would logically land if there were no mats, and then acted out the final impact by throwing herself up as far as she could and landing on the ground.
Great. How's your body?
Yeah, I feel a little bit like I got hit by the ground.
Once I had all that, I took the 2 wide shots into After Effects, put the clean plate on the bottom, and above that, I cut from the 1 shot with the mats right before she hits to the one of her throwing herself on the ground. And I'm leaving a few frames in between these 2 because I'll have to bridge them. To do that, I'm going to duplicate the matte layer, freeze frame, then trim it to just a few frames and mask around Katie. Next, I'll keyframe the position and rotation points to move between the 2 shots and connect the motion. And then, of course, turn on motion blur. Then to the shot of her hitting the ground, I'll add some speed ramping to make the impact happen faster, make it more correct from the height it came from, and feel more vibrant. After that, I'm going to pre-comp all of this, scale up the comp, and then keyframe the position points to pan and tilt with her as she falls to the ground. Of course, we're going to turn on motion blur. After that, we're going to move over to Premiere. And inside Premiere, we're going to drop in our kick shot and then tie that in with our VFX shot. And I also threw on a camera shake preset that I got from Rampant Design.
But even without all of those others, that simple first shot and then changing to the jump up, if you edit correctly, in a film such for you, people are not going to notice.
Now we take a quick break and then get into the rest of the scene. If you're a budding filmmaker, entrepreneur, or innovator, domain.com is the place to go when that next idea hits you. And I know you've heard me say it before that the list of available domain extensions is growing, but you now have the opportunity to name your site and build your brand in ways that was never before possible. Choose from a growing list of 400 plus domain extensions like .com, .org, .design, and .club, and to show you some love.
Get a little bit through their domain. There we go.
After we finished off all the Katie stuff, Irma shows up, which is our 3rd totally badass stunt woman. The short chase happens, and then they end up on the roof for our final fight, which we really lucked out with this epic background. And again, all of this was pretty straightforward with mostly triangle coverage and some specials thrown in using the DJI Phantom, like this shot and this shot. But we talk about all that in our other episode on DJI's channel. There are a few small tricks here, though, like extending a foot or an arm whenever the hit doesn't land perfectly, like in this shot here. Here's what the shot looks like now, going frame by frame. But if I shut off these layers, we see that the original looked like this, which in motion felt like the hit wasn't really landing. So I erased her foot from the shot, then duplicated the original shot, masked around her leg, and then moved it to be right over Cassandra's face. So now we have this. And the last invisible trick was slight sky replacement. In a few of the shots, the sky was this gross, fully blown out white, like in this shot here. Originally, the shot is a little bit lessened because of how gross the sky is blowing out. So I'll grab a sky image and place it in very subtly to keep the image from feeling amateur. For more of a detailed tutorial on how we did the sky replacement, check out our videos on our Film Riot Extras channel right here. The last thing we shot on the day was the opening running scene, which we got by having my DP, Josh Nepper, run full speed through the woods along with our actresses. Those shots, along with everything else, was possible on such a low budget because we were using something like the DJI Osmo. Full disclosure, this is, of course, a project that we were partnering with DJI to make, and they did give us money to help us make the scenes, but I'm not getting paid to say this. I just really mean it. The Osmo is freaking insane. I love this thing. How fast we were able to move while still getting the quality of movement that I wanted was just nuts. There definitely are some things that you need to work around, like the difficulty of pulling focus with it, which I'm sure are things that are going to get refined in newer versions, but overall, I was really blown away by this setup. But that's it. Our first action scene of the bunch, which was made possible thanks to DJI.
So
which
no,
again,
with
you can
very
check out the main
limited,
episodes on their channel right here. And of course, our main
with some very limited special effects, particularly if you're willing to play around with Adobe Premiere and some shops that generally are available to our students, particularly to anyone who's a film student. It's pretty easy to make some pretty remarkable kind of quick scenes that show up, or even just to know what the tricks are to drop in how you move a body part from here by cutting and pasting it and actually just shifting it over a little bit so it looks like a kick or a fall can actually hit. The other person that we actually have to talk about, so that's kind of how we can do it. Here's the master of it. And so when we talk about composing movement, there is no person in the world ever that's been better than Akira Kurosawa. So this is a short video essay that specifically deals with the way he composed movement. If you don't know, Akira Kurosawa is a Japanese director and arguably one of the 5 most important directors, or at least 10 most important directors that has ever lived. His films are a little bit slow by today's standards because he worked all the way from the 1950s to about the 1980s, and even made one film actually about Vincent van Gogh called Crows in the 1980s. His 2 most seminal, most important works are this one here. This is going to be the set of Rashomon. Remember, this is the one where you actually see the rape happen over and over and over and over. And the other one that we're going to see a lot from today is going to be the 7 Samurai. Both of these basically ideas become Westerns in the United States of America, but rather than having samurais, they become cowboy culture. They're called spaghetti Westerns that are based upon this. It's funded by Italians. That's why we actually call them spaghetti. And Westerns because they're basically taking samurai culture and using many of the same features. You will also notice we have a bunch of different scenes that are going to play off in the Avengers movies as well. And so the idea here is if you ever see a superhero that is a superhero that's reluctant and doesn't want to take on the task, it's probably based upon a Kurosawa samurai who was reluctant, didn't want to take on the task. The same thing with the samurai falling in love or a superhero falling in love with someone who is not a superhero, kind of like Pepper Potts until later on when she actually picks up the mantle. If you know her from the comic books and future Marvel Avengers movies, that's actually a Kurosawa concept. The idea of bringing all superheroes together. The idea of a superhero challenging their own good versus bad amongst their own friends. These are all coming out of these samurai films by Kurosawa.
Hi, my name is Tony, and this is Every Frame a Painting. So here's a fundamental question. When you're judging a shot, what's the first thing you look for? Is it balance, leading lines, golden ratio, color, light, shapes? I think these are all essential, and they're all part of good images. But there's one thing I always notice first. Movement.
For me, Kurosawa is the Beethoven of movie directors. It's that recognizable full sound that Beethoven had that is so unmistakable.
A Kurosawa film moves like no one else's. Each one is a masterclass in different types of motion and also ways to combine them. Over a career spanning half a century, he made 30 films, and in all of them, the movement is surprising and cinematic.
No, very much ripped off by Quentin Tarantino later on with the blood spatter that we see in other movies, such as Kill Bill, Volume 1 and Volume 2.
So, what types of movement did he like? First, there's the movement of nature. In every one of his films, the background of the shot features some kind of weather. Wind, water,
and this is very much a Japanese
fire,
aesthetic.
Smoke.
We're going to see this later on. Miyazaki from anime films in Japan is going to basically borrow this technique as well.
In the background to draw your eye.
Push you up. Rain is a real emotional trigger that works in any film. So anything that's excessive, because it gives you another layer that the audience can relate to sensually.
Second, there's the movement of groups. Kurosawa films usually feature large groups of people who either band together or split apart.
I.e. all the references to the Avengers in modern day superhero films.
Any emotion feels big. If you want a good reaction shot, try using 4 people or 25.
Later on, Steven Spielberg does this basically same scene in Jaws.
And if you want something really big, which brings us to number 3, the movement of individuals. One of my favorite things about Kurosawa is that his blocking is unrealistic and exaggerated.
So it's much more theatrical than real.
If someone is nervous, they pace left and right. If they're outraged, they stand straight up.
they're ashamed, he would often tell his actors to pick one gesture for their character and repeat it throughout the film. That way, the audience can quickly see who's who and how they're feeling.
This is the way that large theater actions can happen as well.
Movement of the camera. One of the hallmarks of Kurosawa's style are his fluid camera moves that go from a close-up to a full shot to an over-the-shoulder in a single unbroken take. I did another essay about these shots called the Spielberg Oneer, but what's important here is that every camera move has a clear beginning, middle, and end. Just by itself, this move tells a story. And last, there's movement of the cut. Kurosawa is one of the few directors who worked as his own editor. One of the reasons his movies just flow is that he tends to cut on movement. Often, you're paying so much attention to someone who's moving that you don't see the edit. When he finishes a scene, he switches the rhythm, usually by ending on something static, and then cutting straight into movement. By switching up the rhythm, he keeps you on your toes, because you can't guess the next cut. So with all that, let's break down one scene and study the motion. This scene comes from Seven Samurai. I'm not going to tell you what it's about. See how long it takes you to figure it out. Ready? The first shot shows the whole village, then just the important characters, then just the samurai. Right about here, most people get what's happening. As Kikuchiyo sits down, his action ripples outwards to affect the whole village. Notice how much the wind adds to the scene. Even when people are still, there's that little bit of wind to spice up the frame. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, let's jump 60 years into the future. This is the Avengers. Here, we start with a camera move into an establishing shot. But this time,
These were in Phil Coulson's jacket.
we get dialogue right away. Throughout this scene, the only things that move are the camera and Nick Fury. Even though we have weather outside and actors in the background, none of them are used. Notice that the camera movement doesn't have a beginning or an end, and there's no variation. Each shot goes in the exact same direction.
You had that coming.
But in Seven Samurai, the camera moves have a distinct beginning, middle, and end. And each shot changes the direction from the previous one. As he climbs up, Kurosawa uses the movement of the flag to cut smoothly into this angle, all Seven Samurai and their banner together. This scene has every type of movement, carefully pieced together and spaced throughout. The weather, the group, the individual, the camera, the cut. But this scene tells its story mostly through dialogue.
Called the Avengers Initiative.
Sure, the camera moves, but it's pointless movement. For all the money that was put into it, this scene feels flat.
It's an old-fashioned notion.
But how could you improve a scene like this? Well, if you know what the scene's about, try to express it through movement. Start with the character. How are they feeling? Is there any way the actor can convey that by moving? Okay, maybe too much. Let's be more subtle. Take the feeling that's inside the character and bring it out through the background. If a character is angry and menacing, you can do this. Or if she's simmering with resentment. Another option is to contrast one person against the group. So if somebody suffers a very public humiliation, this works. Or if they're looking for a needle in a haystack. You can use camera movement to convey excitement. You can cut on movement to show surprise. And you can combine every type of motion into one amazing image. By the way, you don't need to put every type of movement in every shot. That's just tiring. But there's a nice middle ground with lots of variation and subtlety. And you won't know what works best until you try it. If you combine the right motion and the right emotion, you get something cinematic.
But just for me, I look at this as 2-3 times a year to feel, oh wow, that's why I wanted to be a filmmaker, and look what I'm doing now. Special effects. and then another movie about special effects, and then the third movie about special effects.
Now pick any of his films, go to any scene, and watch how everything moves together.
You know, it's the visual stimulation that hits the audience. And that's the reason for film. Otherwise, we should just turn the light on and call it radio.
And as we think about it, he really is the master of movement that show up. So if we look at this Avengers scene, how do we fix the kinetic energy? Like, it's a well-shot scene. It gets the ideas across. But note how most of it is done through very graphic editing versus through anything that we just learned about in terms of kinetics. Look at all the action that you have here. And it's like having a handheld camera, which doesn't do much for us. Right? We could have wind that's actually playing through here. We could have the idea of individuals running away from the bomb, which we haven't seen. Now we're starting to see them. But note, the focus is so much on the individual character that we don't get the terror that's taking place around them. Note how isolated the area is. So the action is cut so fast that the fight scenes themselves don't appear A, realistic, and B, it's cut so fast they don't actually have to fight that well. They're constantly going to be missing one another. You can see actually, as we've learned from the fight scenes, by editing, we can literally just edit out a very bad fight and punches where they actually don't hit each other. You look really closely, they're not always hitting each other. That's one of the challenges when we look at the Avengers versus some of the other scenes. We're so used to seeing this, so that there might be a better way of actually conducting motion if we actually take the time. Remember, but one of the issues that shows up is the Avengers movies are basically made up until you're about 30 years of age, right? They are for the main audience up to 30, maybe 35. And so the individuals that really kind of understand film are a little bit older in many capacities. And so they're edited quite differently. The best part about that was the scene all the way at the end where we get the surprise and learn, oh my goodness, it's Bucky. Or I should say, Captain Rogers learns it's Bucky. Thank you very much. I hope everything is going well and have a wonderful night. Bye.